That's fake. Real badges don't come from cereal boxes. Officer Jake Morrison's words cut through the humid Atlanta evening air like a blade, sharp and deliberate. The laughter that followed from his partner, Officer Brad Collins, echoed off the brick walls of the downtown government building, bouncing back like mockery made manifest. Diane Washington stood perfectly still on the courthouse steps, her hand extended, holding her credentials in the dying light of a Tuesday that had started like any other. The gold badge caught the streetlight for just a moment before Jake's flashlight beam hit it, casting harsh shadows across the embossed seal that read, Attorney General, State of Georgia. "Ma'am, step away from the building," Brad called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of assuming it belonged to him. "This is a restricted area after 6 p.m. Diane didn't move. Not backward, not forward. She stood like someone who had learned long ago that movement could be misinterpreted, that stillness was sometimes the only defense against assumptions that came wrapped in uniforms and carried in holsters. "I'm here on official business," she said, her voice level, measured, each word carefully chosen, each syllable deliberate. "I need to access my office." Jake snorted. Actually snorted like she'd told him she was there to meet the Easter Bunny. "Your office? Lady, do you see that sign?" He gestured with his flashlight toward the brass plaque beside the main entrance. "Georgia Attorney General. You're about 40 years too young and the wrong color for that job." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for decades. Brad chuckled, the sound low and comfortable, like this was Tuesday night entertainment, nothing more. Diane looked at both officers. Jake, maybe 35, with the kind of confident stance that came from never being questioned. Brad, younger, following his partner's lead like he'd been trained to do. Both white, both certain, both wrong. "Check the badge again," she said simply. Jake leaned closer, making a show of squinting at her credentials. Then he straightened up and looked at Brad with theatrical amazement. "Brad, look at this. She's got herself a real authentic-looking fake badge. Wonder where she got it made." "Probably online," Brad replied, grinning. "You can get anything on the internet these days. Police badges, FBI shields, probably Attorney General credentials too." A car turned the corner, its headlights briefly illuminating the three figures on the courthouse steps. In that moment, Diane could see herself from the outside. A black woman in a navy blazer and dark slacks, professional but not ostentatious, standing between two white police officers who were treating her like she was performing street theater for their amusement. "Officers," she said, and something in her tone made Jake's smirk falter just slightly. "I'm going to ask you one more time to verify my credentials through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Jake laughed, but the sound was different now, less certain. "Lady, proper channels don't involve random people showing up at government buildings after hours claiming to be the top law enforcement official in the state." Brad nodded enthusiastically. "What's next? You gonna tell us you're the governor too?" Diane reached slowly into her blazer pocket, her movements deliberate and visible. Both officers tensed, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. She pulled out her phone with the same careful precision she'd shown her badge. "I'm calling my security detail," she said calmly. "They're going to be very interested in this conversation." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Security detail?" "Now she's got a security detail, Brad. This keeps getting better." "Yeah, probably calls her boyfriend her security detail," Brad added, and they both laughed again. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the way Diane held herself, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in her posture. Maybe it was the expensive cut of her blazer, or the way she spoke with the kind of measured authority that came from years of being listened to in rooms where decisions got made. Or maybe it was the way her phone call connected immediately, without going to voicemail, without the usual rings that regular people's calls required. "This is Diane," she said into the phone, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I'm at the downtown courthouse. There's been a misunderstanding with building security." Jake and Brad exchanged a look. The kind of look that passed between partners when something that should have been simple started feeling complicated. A voice on the other end of the phone was audible, tinny, but urgent. Diane listened for a moment, then said, "No, don't escalate yet, but have the team ready." She ended the call and looked back at the two officers. "Gentlemen, my security detail is 3 minutes away. When they arrive, they're going to want to review this incident in detail. This would be an excellent time for you to reconsider your approach." Brad shifted uncomfortably. "Jake, maybe we should—" "Should what?" Jake interrupted. "Let every con artist in Atlanta walk into government buildings because they've got a fake badge and a smartphone? That's not how this works." Diane tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Officer Morrison, isn't it? Badge number 4472. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his name tag, then stopped. "How do you—" "I make it a point to know the officers who work security details for state buildings," Diane said. "Officer Collins, badge number 5891. You've both been commended for your service. Good records. No major disciplinary actions. Until tonight." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable mockery that had preceded it. This silence carried weight, like the moment before thunder when the air itself seems to hold its breath. In the distance, the sound of approaching engines grew audible. Not one car, but several. The distinctive rumble of official vehicles moving with purpose through downtown traffic. "Listen," Brad said, his voice losing its earlier confidence. "Maybe we should just call this in. Let the sergeant sort it out." Jake's jaw tightened. Pride and doubt warred visibly across his features. "We're not calling anything in. This woman is attempting to impersonate a state official. That's a felony." Diane's phone buzzed. A text message. She glanced at it, then looked back at the officers. "Officer Morrison, Officer Collins, you have approximately 90 seconds to de-escalate this situation before it becomes a career-defining moment for both of you." The first black SUV rounded the corner, followed by a second, then a third. No sirens, but the vehicles moved with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of training and authority. They pulled up to the curb with military efficiency, and the evening air filled with the sound of car doors opening simultaneously. Jake's face had gone pale. "Brad, what kind of con artist travels with a motorcade?" But Brad was already stepping back, his hand moving away from his weapon, his entire posture shifting from aggressive to defensive. "Jake, I think we might have made a mistake." The first man out of the lead SUV was tall, black, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. He moved toward Diane with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear he wasn't there for conversation. "Ma'am, are you secure?" he asked, positioning himself between Diane and the two officers. "I'm fine, Jerome," Diane replied. "But we have a situation that needs to be handled carefully." Jerome Foster, head of the Attorney General's security detail, looked at Jake and Brad with eyes that had seen enough to know exactly what had happened here. "Officers, I'm going to need you to step back and place your hands where I can see them." "Now wait just a minute," Jake started, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "We're conducting official police business here." Two more security agents had moved to flank the officers, their positions casual but strategic. A woman emerged from the second SUV, also black, wearing the kind of professional attire that marked her as someone who attended meetings where policy got made. "Good evening," she said, approaching with a tablet in her hand. "I'm Keisha Davis, legal counsel for the Attorney General's office. Gentlemen, you're about to be involved in what we call a teachable moment." Jake looked from Diane to Jerome to Keisha, then back to his partner. Brad was staring at the ground like he wanted it to open up and swallow him whole. "This is insane," Jake muttered. "You people can't just—" "Officer Morrison," Diane interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest with surgical precision. "You people—" The words landed like a physical blow. In the space of 3 syllables, the entire evening crystallized into what it had always been. Not a misunderstanding, not a case of mistaken identity, not an unfortunate series of coincidences. Jake's mouth opened, then closed. The color drained from his face as the full weight of what he'd just said settled over the group like smoke from a fire that had been burning all along, invisible until someone finally turned on the lights. Diane looked at him for a long moment, then at Brad, then at the badges they wore and the building they were supposed to be protecting. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of every black woman who had ever stood on courthouse steps, credentials in hand, waiting for justice to decide whether she was worthy of the uniform she wore. Gentlemen, let me reintroduce myself. I'm Diane Washington, Attorney General for the state of Georgia, and you've just provided me with a textbook example of why we need to have some very serious conversations about bias in law enforcement. The evening air seemed to still around them, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when fake badges met real authority and laughter died in the face of consequences that had been decades in the making. The path that led Diane Washington to those courthouse steps on a humid Tuesday evening began 37 years earlier in a small apartment above a dry cleaner's shop in East Atlanta, where the smell of starch and determination filled the air in equal measure. Her mother, Ruth Washington, worked double shifts at Grady Hospital, her scrubs always crisp despite the 16-hour days. Her father, James Washington, taught high school history and coached debate team, coming home every evening with stories about kids who had potential but needed someone to believe in it. Education is the equalizer, James would say, grading papers at their kitchen table while Diane did her homework beside him. But it only works if you understand the system well enough to change it from the inside. By the time Diane was 12, she could recite the Constitution from memory. Not because her father forced her to, but because she wanted to understand the rules of the game everyone else seemed to be playing. She read Supreme Court cases the way other kids read comic books, absorbing the language of law and justice like it was a foreign language she was determined to master. At Westlake High School, she was the kind of student who asked questions that made teachers uncomfortable. When they studied the civil rights movement, she asked why the laws had to be changed if they were supposed to be equal all along. When they discussed the justice system, she asked why outcomes seemed to vary based on factors that weren't supposed to matter. Because, her debate coach, Mrs. Henderson, told her after one particularly intense practice session, the system works exactly as it was designed to work. The question is whether you're going to accept that design or become an architect yourself. Diane chose architecture. At Howard University, she studied political science with the same intensity other students brought to parties. She interned at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she learned that justice wasn't just about knowing the law. It was about understanding the people who interpreted it, enforced it, and lived under its protection or its weight. Her law school years at Yale were a masterclass in being the only one, the only black woman in most of her classes, the only person who had to explain that her questions about prosecutorial discretion weren't theoretical exercises, but attempts to understand a system that affected people who looked like her in ways that affected people who didn't. Washington, Professor Hartwell said after one particularly heated constitutional law discussion, "You argue like you're trying to save the world." "No, sir," Diane replied. "I argue like I'm trying to understand it well enough to make it work the way it's supposed to." She graduated summa cum laude and returned to Georgia, where she spent 5 years as a prosecutor in Fulton County. It was there that she learned the difference between law and justice, between what the books said should happen and what actually happened when the books met the street. She prosecuted cases where the evidence was clear but the outcomes were clouded by factors that weren't supposed to matter. She watched juries deliberate with the weight of assumptions they didn't even know they carried. She saw judges hand down sentences that followed the letter of the law but missed its spirit entirely. After 3 years, she was promoted to the white-collar crime division, where she developed a reputation for thoroughness that made corporate lawyers nervous and fellow prosecutors respectful. She didn't just build cases, she built them with the kind of careful attention to detail that left no room for doubt or bias to creep into the cracks. Her breakthrough came with the Meridian banking scandal, a complex fraud case involving millions of dollars in misappropriated funds that had been funneled through a network of shell companies. Other prosecutors had looked at the case and seen an impossible web of financial transactions that would take years to untangle. Diane saw a pattern. She spent 8 months building the case, working 16-hour days, following money trails that led through 3 states and 2 countries. When the trial began, she presented evidence with the kind of systematic precision that turned complexity into clarity. The defendants were convicted on all counts. More importantly, Diane had established herself as someone who could take apart systems that others found too complicated to understand. Georgia's governor, Patricia Hendricks, took notice. "I need someone to head up the state's new economic crimes task force," Governor Hendricks told Diane during a meeting in the state capitol building. "Someone who understands that white-collar crime doesn't stop at county lines or respect jurisdictional boundaries." Diane took the job and spent the next 4 years building prosecutions that reached into corporate boardrooms and political backrooms with equal efficiency. She learned to navigate the political dimensions of law enforcement, understanding that justice sometimes required building coalitions and sometimes required standing alone. When Attorney General Harold Kessler announced he wouldn't seek re-election, Diane's name appeared on every list of potential successors. She had the legal credentials, the prosecutorial experience, and the political relationships necessary for the job. What she didn't have was the expectation that she would get it. The race was competitive. 3 other candidates had entered the Democratic primary, 2 former district attorneys and a current state legislator. All 3 were white. All 3 assumed that their experience spoke for itself. Diane's campaign was different. She didn't just talk about her qualifications. She talked about her vision. Criminal justice reform that focused on outcomes, not just processes. Economic crime prosecution that followed money wherever it led, regardless of who was holding it. Civil rights enforcement that didn't wait for violations to become crises. "The Attorney General's office isn't just about prosecuting crimes," she said during a televised debate 6 weeks before the primary. "It's about ensuring that the law works for everyone equally. And equality isn't something you achieve once and then forget about. It's something you have to actively protect every day in every case, with every decision you make." She won the primary with 62% of the vote. The general election was closer, but she prevailed with a coalition that included suburban voters concerned about white-collar crime, urban voters focused on criminal justice reform, and rural voters who appreciated her straightforward approach to law enforcement. On January 15th, 3 years earlier, Diane Washington had been sworn in as Georgia's Attorney General, becoming the first black woman to hold the office. She stood on the Capitol steps, her hand on the same Bible her father had used when he was sworn in as a school board member 30 years earlier, and promised to uphold the Constitution and laws of Georgia. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was taking an oath to defend laws that had once been used to exclude people who looked like her from the very building where she now worked. Her first year in office had been about establishing credibility. She reorganized the Economic Crimes Division, created a new civil rights enforcement unit, and launched a comprehensive review of prosecutorial practices across the state. She worked 12-hour days and weekend sessions, building relationships with law enforcement agencies, civil rights organizations, and business leaders. She learned that being the first meant that every decision was scrutinized not just for its legal merits, but for what it meant about her fitness for the office. She couldn't just be competent. She had to be unquestionably excellent. She couldn't just follow established practices. She had to improve them. By her second year, the office was running with the kind of efficiency that earned respect from colleagues and cooperation from agencies that had been skeptical of change. Crime rates were down, white-collar prosecutions were up, and civil rights complaints were being handled with a promptness that hadn't existed before. But respect from institutions wasn't the same as acceptance from individuals. Diane still got looks when she walked into meetings where she was the only black person in the room. She still had to establish her authority in ways that white men in similar positions never did. She still encountered assumptions about her qualifications, her temperament, and her right to be where she was. Most of the time, she handled it with the same professional grace she'd developed over years of being the only one. She answered questions about her background with patience, addressed doubts about her experience with facts, and demonstrated her competence through results. But sometimes, like on a humid Tuesday evening outside the courthouse where she worked, patience wasn't enough. Because sometimes the system's failure wasn't institutional or abstract. Sometimes it was personal and immediate, played out under streetlights by people who wore badges but couldn't see past the color of her skin to recognize the authority she carried. Those were the moments when all the education, all the experience, all the careful relationship building came down to a simple question: would the law she'd sworn to uphold protect her when she needed it most? Standing on those courthouse steps, facing officers who laughed at her credentials and questioned her right to enter the building where her name was engraved on the door, Diane Washington was about to find out. The arrival of Diane's security detail had shifted the dynamic on the courthouse steps, but Jake Morrison wasn't ready to concede the narrative. Even with 3 black SUVs parked at the curb and 5 federal agents positioned strategically around the entrance, he clung to his initial assessment like a man holding onto a rope that was already fraying. "Look," Jake said, his voice carrying a defiance that sounded increasingly hollow. "I don't care how many people she brought with her. Anybody can hire security. That doesn't make her credentials real." Jerome Foster, the head of Diane's security detail, exchanged a glance with Keisha Davis. They'd both seen this before. The moment when reality collided with assumptions so deeply held that evidence couldn't shake them loose. "Officer Morrison," Jerome said, his tone professional but firm, "I'm going to need you to contact your supervisor immediately." "My supervisor?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "My supervisor didn't tell me to let random people into secured government buildings just because they showed up with an entourage." Brad Collins had been quiet since the SUVs arrived, studying the faces around him with growing unease. "Jake," he said quietly, "maybe we should call this in." "We're not calling anything in," Jake snapped. "We're handling a situation exactly as we were trained to handle it." Diane had been silent through this exchange, watching the interplay between the two officers with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for jury selection. Jake was the problem, but Brad was the key. Brad was beginning to doubt himself, which meant he was beginning to think. "Officer Collins," she said, her voice cutting through Jake's bluster, "what's your protocol for verifying official identification?" Brad shifted uncomfortably. We run it through dispatch, check the database." "Have you done that yet?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake jumped in before Brad could answer. "We don't need to run every fake badge through the system. We can spot them with our eyes." "Can you?" Diane asked. "Officer Morrison, how many Attorney General badges have you seen in your career?" Jake's jaw tightened, enough to know what they're supposed to look like. "Really? Because this is the first one I've seen that wasn't my own," Diane replied, "and I've been Attorney General for 3 years. Keisha Davis stepped forward, holding her tablet. "Gentlemen, would it help if I showed you the Attorney General's official photo from the state website?" "Anyone can doctor a website," Jake muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Keisha tapped her tablet screen and held it out. The Georgia state seal appeared, followed by official portraits of state officials. When she scrolled to the Attorney General's section, there was Diane Washington, professional headshot, official title, biography detailing her education and experience. Brad stared at the screen, then at Diane, then back at the screen. The resemblance was unmistakable, not just physical, but in the way she held herself, the confident set of her shoulders, the direct gaze that suggested someone accustomed to authority. "Jake," Brad said quietly, "I think we need to—" "Need to what?" Jake interrupted. "Believe everything we see on the internet? That could be anyone's website." Jerome's phone buzzed. He answered it with a crisp "Foster," listened for a moment, then said, "Understood. We'll maintain position." He ended the call and looked at Diane. "Ma'am, the governor's office has been notified. They're sending someone over." Jake's face went pale. "The governor's office? Standard protocol," Jerome explained. "When there's an incident involving the Attorney General, we notify all relevant state agencies." A new voice cut through the evening air. "What exactly is the nature of this incident?" Everyone turned to see a woman approaching from the parking garage. Tall, white, wearing a business suit that looked expensive even under the harsh streetlights. She moved with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone used to having her presence acknowledged. "Captain Harper," Jake said, and the relief in his voice was audible. "These people are claiming this woman is the Attorney General." Captain Lisa Harper of the Georgia State Patrol looked at the assembled group. The officers, the security detail, the black SUVs, and finally at Diane herself. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. "Ma'am," she said to Diane, "I'm Captain Harper, Georgia State Patrol. May I see your identification?" Diane handed over her credentials without hesitation. Captain Harper examined them carefully, turning the badge over in her hands, studying the holographic security features, the weight and feel of genuine government-issued identification. "These appear to be authentic," Captain Harper said after a long moment. "Appear to be?" Jake said. "Captain, with all due respect, appearances can be deceiving." Captain Harper looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested his respect wasn't actually worth much. "Officer Morrison, when was the last time you verified a badge through official channels?" "We were about to—" "That wasn't my question." Captain Harper's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years dealing with officers who thought they could interpret policy creatively. "When was the last time you actually followed proper verification procedures instead of making assumptions?" Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Brad looked like he wanted to disappear into the concrete. Captain Harper pulled out her phone and dialed. "Dispatch, this is Captain Harper. I need you to verify the identity of Georgia Attorney General Diane Washington. Physical description: African-American female, approximately 5 feet 7 inches. Professional attire, brown hair." She looked at Diane. "Any distinguishing features you'd like me to mention?" "Tell them I have a small scar on my left hand from a childhood bicycle accident," Diane said. "It's in my security file." Captain Harper relayed the information and waited. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt longer under the courthouse lights, with Jake Morrison's career hanging in the balance. "Confirmed," Captain Harper said, ending the call. "Gentlemen, you're looking at the Attorney General of Georgia." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when reality finally breaks through delusion, with enough force to shatter it completely. Jake stared at Diane like he was seeing her for the first time, which, in a way, he was. "That's impossible," he said, but the words came out as a whisper. "Officer Morrison," Diane said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "What exactly is impossible? That a black woman could be Attorney General? That someone who doesn't look like your expectation of authority could actually possess it? Or that you might have made assumptions based on factors that have nothing to do with qualifications or credentials?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to realize that anything he said would only make things worse. Captain Harper stepped forward. "Ma'am, on behalf of the Georgia State Patrol, I apologize for this incident. These officers should have followed proper verification procedures from the beginning." "They should have," Diane agreed. "But the question now is what we're going to do about it." Brad found his voice first. "Ma'am, I want to apologize. We made a mistake." "And Officer Collins," Diane interrupted, "this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is when you accidentally input the wrong information into a computer. This was a series of deliberate decisions based on assumptions about who I am and what I'm worth based on how I look." She turned to Jake. "Officer Morrison, you didn't just question my credentials. You mocked them. You didn't just doubt my authority. You laughed at it. You didn't just make an error in judgment. You made it clear that, in your view, Someone who looks like me couldn't possibly belong where I was standing. Jake's face had gone through several color changes during this speech, settling finally on a grayish pallor that suggested a man beginning to understand the full scope of his situation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, "I was just doing my job." "No," Diane replied, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You were doing what you thought your job was. There's a difference. Your job was to verify credentials and ensure building security. What you did was profile, assume, and mock. Those aren't the same thing." Keisha Davis had been taking notes on her tablet throughout the exchange. "Ma'am, do you want me to initiate formal proceedings?" Diane looked around the group at Jerome and his security team, at Captain Harper, at Brad Collins, who looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock, and finally at Jake Morrison, who was still trying to figure out how his routine evening had become a career-ending catastrophe. "Not yet," she said. "First, I want to understand how we got here." She walked closer to Jake, close enough that he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the authority in her bearing, all the things he had missed when he was too busy seeing what he expected to see instead of what was actually there. "Officer Morrison, I want you to tell me what you saw when I first showed you my badge." Jake swallowed hard. I saw someone who didn't look like." "Like what?" "What? Like someone who would be the Attorney General. And what does the Attorney General look like, in your experience?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an honest answer that Jake Morrison wasn't sure he was brave enough to give. Jake Morrison stood under the courthouse lights, facing the weight of a question that demanded an honesty he'd never been required to provide. "What does the Attorney General look like?" The words echoed in his head while the assembled group waited for an answer that would reveal everything about his assumptions and nothing flattering about his character. Jake started, then stopped. His eyes darted from Diane to Captain Harper to his partner Brad, searching for some escape from a moment that was becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. "Take your time," Diane said, her voice carrying the kind of patience that felt more dangerous than anger. "This is important." Jake straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim some of the authority that had evaporated when Captain Harper confirmed Diane's identity. "Look, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know what state officials look like when they come to this building. And what do they look like? They look official, professional, like they belong in government." Diane nodded slowly. "I see. And in your professional opinion, I don't look official or professional?" Jake's jaw worked silently. Every answer felt like stepping into quicksand. "It's not about professional," he said finally. "It's about looking the part." "The part of Attorney General?" "The part of someone with that kind of authority." Diane tilted her head slightly. "Officer Morrison, I'm wearing a tailored blazer, pressed slacks, and professional shoes. I carry myself with confidence and speak with the vocabulary of someone educated in the law. My credentials are authentic government-issued identification. What exactly about my appearance suggests I lack authority?" The question sliced through Jake's defenses like a scalpel, exposing the ugly assumptions he'd been trying to dress up in the language of professional judgment. Brad Collins stepped forward, his voice shaky but determined. "Ma'am, I think what Jake is trying to say is that we're used to seeing, that is, most of the officials who come here after hours are what, Officer Collins?" Brad looked at his partner, then at the ground, then back at Diane. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Are white." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally been acknowledged. No one moved, no one spoke. The truth sat among them, ugly and undeniable. Thank you for your honesty, Diane said finally. Officer Collins, at least you're willing to name what we're really talking about. She turned to Jake. Officer Morrison, Officer Collins just acknowledged what you've been dancing around for the past 20 minutes. You saw a black woman with credentials and decided she couldn't possibly be who she said she was, not because of anything she did or said, but because of how she looked. Jake's face flushed red. That's not. I mean, it wasn't about race. What was it about then? It was about security, about protecting this building from people who might try to impersonate officials. How often does that happen? The question caught Jake off guard. How often does what happen? How often do people attempt to impersonate the Attorney General to gain access to this building? Jake blinked. I don't know of any specific cases. So you decided that tonight, a black woman with authentic credentials was probably the first? Jerome Foster had been watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar confrontations before. Officer Morrison, he said, his voice calm but firm. In my 15 years heading security details for state officials, I've never encountered anyone attempting to impersonate an attorney general. Do you know why? Jake shook his head. Because it's a federal crime with a minimum sentence of 5 years in prison, and because attorney general credentials are some of the most secure identification in the state government, the kind of person who could forge them convincingly wouldn't need to break into a government building. They'd already be wealthy enough to buy whatever they wanted. Keisha Davis looked up from her tablet. Also, Officer Morrison, if you had followed standard verification procedures, this entire incident could have been avoided in less than 3 minutes. Captain Harper stepped forward. Gentlemen, let me be clear about something. Standard operating procedure for this type of situation is simple. When presented with official identification, you verify it through proper channels. You don't make judgment calls based on whether someone looks the part. You follow the process. But Captain, Jake said, desperation creeping into his voice, we're supposed to use our judgment too, aren't we? I mean, if something seems off. What seemed off? Diane asked. My credentials were authentic. My demeanor was professional. I explained my purpose clearly. What exactly triggered your suspicion? Jake looked around the group, searching for support that wasn't there. Brad had moved slightly away from him, physically distancing himself from his partner's position. Captain Harper wore the expression of someone watching a career self-destruct in real time. Diane's security details stood ready but relaxed, their body language suggesting this was an educational moment rather than a threat. Jake started, then stopped. I just didn't think. You didn't think a black woman could be Attorney General, Diane finished for him. That's what you're trying not to say. The words hit like a physical blow. Jake's shoulders sagged, the fight going out of him as the full weight of his situation became clear. Ma'am, he said, his voice hollow. I'm sorry. Officer Morrison, I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This is about a systemic problem in how law enforcement interacts with people of color, even when those people are in positions of authority. She gestured toward the courthouse behind them. This building represents justice, the rule of law, equal protection under the Constitution. When officers sworn to uphold that law treat citizens differently based on race, they undermine the very foundation of what we're supposed to represent. Captain Harper nodded grimly. Ma'am, you're absolutely right. This incident reflects a training failure and a judgment failure that goes beyond these two officers. She turned to Jake and Brad. Gentlemen, you're both suspended pending a full investigation I want your badges and weapons." "Suspended?" Jake's voice cracked. "Captain, we were just doing our jobs." "No, you weren't," Captain Harper replied coldly. "You were profiling a state official based on racial assumptions. That's not police work. That's bias with a badge." Brad slowly removed his badge and service weapon, his hands shaking. Jake stood frozen for a moment, then reluctantly followed suit. "Captain," Jake said, his voice desperate now, "this is going to ruin my career." "Officer Morrison," Diane said quietly, "your career should be ruined if this is how you treat citizens. The question is whether you're going to learn from this moment or just resent the consequences." A new voice cut through the tension. "Attorney General Washington?" Everyone turned to see a young black man approaching from the parking area. Mid-20s, wearing jeans and a hoodie. He walked with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to be visible but non-threatening in the presence of police. "Tyrone Jackson, ma'am," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I work night security for the building across the street. I saw what was happening and—" he gestured toward his phone. "I recorded some of it." Jake's face went white. "You recorded us?" "Just the parts where you were laughing at her badge and calling it fake," Tyrone said. "Figured someone might want to see how Atlanta police treat the Attorney General when they don't recognize her." Jerome stepped forward. "Mr. Jackson, we appreciate your civic awareness, but we're handling this internally." "With respect, sir," Tyrone replied. "This isn't just internal anymore. This is about how these officers treat anyone who doesn't look like what they expect authority to look like." Diane studied Tyrone for a moment. "Mr. Jackson, have you had similar experiences with law enforcement?" Tyrone's laugh was bitter. "Ma'am, I'm a young black man in Atlanta. I've had experiences." "Tell me about them." "Attorney General," Captain Harper interjected. "This isn't the time or place for Captain Harper." Diane's voice carried the unmistakable tone of authority. "This is exactly the time and place, Mr. Jackson. Please continue." Tyrone looked around the group, his eyes settling on Jake and Brad. 3 months ago, I was walking to my car after my shift. Same uniform I'm wearing now. Same building I work in every night. These 2 officers stopped me, said I looked suspicious walking around downtown at 2 a.m. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Brad stared at the ground. They asked for ID, which I provided. Asked what I was doing in the area, which I explained. Asked if I had been drinking, which I hadn't. Asked if I had a criminal record, which I don't. Asked if they could search my car, which I politely declined. "What happened then?" Diane asked. "Officer Morrison here told me I was being uncooperative, said that honest people don't refuse searches, threatened to call for backup if I didn't comply." Jake's face had gone through several color changes. "That's not. We were following procedure." "What procedure?" Diane asked sharply. "What procedure allows you to detain and search a citizen who has committed no crime, violated no law, and posed no threat?" "He was in a high-crime area at an unusual hour," Jake said weakly. "He was walking to his car after work," Diane replied. "In the area where he works. At the time his shift ends." "What exactly was unusual about that?" Tyrone continued. "Ma'am, they searched my car anyway. Said they smelled marijuana, which was impossible since I don't smoke. Spent 20 minutes going through my belongings, found nothing, then let me go with a warning about being more cooperative in the future." "More cooperative with what?" Diane asked. "With illegal searches? With harassment? With being treated like a criminal for existing while black?" The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Captain Harper looked like she wanted to disappear. Jerome was taking notes. Keisha was recording everything on her tablet. "Mr. Jackson," Diane said, "did you file a complaint about this incident?" "I tried to, ma'am. Went to the precinct the next day, spoke with the desk sergeant. He told me that the officers were just doing their jobs, and that if I didn't like how I was treated, maybe I should consider why I was in that area at that time of night." The desk sergeant said that? His exact words were, "If you don't want police attention, don't put yourself in situations where you look suspicious." Diane turned to Captain Harper. "Captain, are you familiar with this incident?" Captain Harper's jaw was tight. "I'll be reviewing all interactions these officers have had with citizens over the past year." "You'll be reviewing them tonight," Diane said firmly, "and you'll be providing me with a full report by Friday." She looked back at Jake and Brad. "Gentlemen, do you understand what just happened here? You didn't just make a mistake with me. You've been making mistakes with citizens who don't have security details and attorney general badges. Citizens who trusted that you would treat them fairly and discovered that fairness depends on looking like what you expect to see." Brad found his voice. "Ma'am, we never meant to, Officer Collins. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is discrimination. You may not have meant to profile citizens based on race, but that's exactly what you did. And the fact that you're only now understanding the problem suggests this is a pattern, not an aberration." A car door slammed in the distance, and everyone turned to see another official vehicle approaching. This one bore the seal of the governor's office. "Ma'am," Jerome said quietly, "Governor Hendricks' chief of staff is here." Diane nodded. "Good. It's time to expand this conversation beyond just these two officers." The chief of staff, a middle-aged white woman named Sandra Mills, approached with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. She surveyed the scene, the suspended officers, the security detail, the civilian witness, and immediately understood that this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. "Attorney General Washington," she said, extending her hand, "Governor Hendricks sends her apologies for this incident and her full support for whatever action you deem appropriate." "Thank you, Sandra. What I deem appropriate is a comprehensive review of law enforcement interactions with citizens of color, starting with these officers and expanding to department-wide training and accountability measures." Sandra nodded. The governor anticipated that request. She's prepared to announce the formation of a special commission on police accountability with you as the chair. Jake Morrison, who had been silent through most of this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "This is insane. One incident and you're going to overhaul the entire police force?" The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. "One incident?" Diane turned to face him fully. "Officer Morrison, did you not hear Mr. Jackson describe how you treated him 3 months ago? Did you not understand that your behavior toward me was part of a pattern, not an isolated event?" Jake's face was red with frustration and fear. "Look, I'm sorry if we made some mistakes, but you can't destroy careers over misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" Tyrone stepped forward. "Officer Morrison, there was no misunderstanding when you searched my car illegally. There was no misunderstanding when you told me I looked suspicious for walking to my car after work. And there was no misunderstanding when you laughed at the Attorney General's badge because you couldn't believe a black woman could hold that office." Jake looked around the group, searching for support that wasn't there. Even Brad had stepped away from him, physically and metaphorically distancing himself from his partner's increasingly desperate position. "I'm not a racist," Jake said, his voice cracking. "I've never used racial slurs. I've never—" "Officer Morrison," Diane interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest with surgical precision, "racism isn't just about slurs. It's about assumptions. It's about treating people differently based on the color of their skin. It's about seeing a black woman with credentials and deciding she must be a fraud. It's about seeing a black man walking to his car and deciding he must be suspicious. She stepped closer to him. You may not think you're a racist, but your actions tonight and 3 months ago suggest otherwise. The question now is whether you're going to acknowledge that reality and work to change it, or continue to deny it and face the consequences. The courthouse steps had become an impromptu courtroom, with Diane as both prosecutor and judge, presenting evidence of a pattern of behavior that went beyond individual bias to systemic discrimination. "Ma'am," Sandra Mills said quietly, "how do you want to proceed?" Diane looked around the assembled group, at Captain Harper, who was clearly struggling with the implications for her department, at Jerome and her security team, who had seen this kind of incident before, at Tyrone Jackson, who represented countless citizens who had been treated unfairly, at Jake and Brad, whose careers hung in the balance. "We proceed with truth," she said finally. "We proceed with accountability, and we proceed with the understanding that this ends tonight. Not just this incident, but the pattern of behavior that made it possible." The evening air was still humid, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as 2 officers harassing a woman they didn't recognize had become a reckoning with problems that ran much deeper than one mistaken encounter on courthouse steps. Sandra Mills opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing political crises. "Attorney General, Governor Hendricks has authorized me to share some preliminary information that might be relevant to tonight's discussion." Diane raised an eyebrow. "What kind of information?" "The kind that suggests this incident wasn't as isolated as Officer Morrison would like us to believe." Jake's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" Sandra tapped her tablet screen. Over the past 6 months, the governor's office has received 17 complaints about police interactions in downtown Atlanta. 13 of those complaints specifically mentioned Officers Morrison and Collins. The words hit like a physical blow. Brad staggered slightly. Jake's mouth opened and closed without sound. 17 complaints? Captain Harper's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Why wasn't I informed?" "Because they weren't filed through official police channels," Sandra replied. "Citizens called the governor's office, the attorney general's office, the NAACP, the Urban League. They went everywhere except to the police department." Tyrone Jackson nodded grimly. "That's because filing complaints with the police is like asking the Fox to investigate chicken disappearances." "Mr. Jackson raises an important point," Diane said. "When citizens don't trust the complaint process, they seek alternative channels. Sandra, what did these complaints allege?" Sandra scrolled through her tablet. Harassment, illegal searches, detainment without cause, racial profiling, verbal intimidation. The pattern is consistent across different complainants who don't know each other and filed reports weeks apart. She looked up at Jake and Brad. "Officers, you've been the subject of more complaints in 6 months than most officers receive in their entire careers." Jake found his voice. "Complaints don't mean we did anything wrong. People complain about police work because they don't like being held accountable for their actions." "Is that what happened with Mr. Jackson?" Diane asked coldly. "He was being held accountable for walking to his car after work?" Brad stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Ma'am, if these complaints are legitimate, why weren't we disciplined? Why didn't anyone investigate?" It was a good question, and Diane could see that Brad was genuinely confused. Jake, on the other hand, looked like he already knew the answer and was hoping no one else would figure it out. "Officer Collins, that's exactly what we're going to find out," Captain Harper said. "But first, I want to hear about these complaints directly." Sandra consulted her tablet again. The first complaint came from Alicia Freeman, a social worker who was stopped while leaving the courthouse after a late hearing. Officers Morrison and Collins questioned her for 15 minutes, searched her purse, and demanded to know why she was in the area after hours. "Freeman is a licensed social worker who regularly appears in family court," Diane added. She's been working in this building longer than either of these officers has been on the force. The second complaint, Sandra continued, came from Jerome Washington, an attorney who was stopped while walking from his car to the courthouse for an early morning hearing. Jake shifted uncomfortably. We stop a lot of people. We can't be expected to recognize every attorney in the city. Officer Morrison, Diane's voice carried a warning. Jerome Washington is a federal prosecutor. He's worked out of this courthouse for 8 years. He carries federal identification and was wearing a business suit. What exactly made him suspicious enough to warrant detention? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jake's silence provided its own answer. Sandra scrolled down. The third complaint came from Dr. Alicia Newman, an emergency room physician who was attending a late-night deposition. Officers Morrison and Collins questioned her credentials, searched her medical bag, and suggested she was probably lying about her profession. Dr. Newman, Diane said, her voice getting harder, is one of Atlanta's most respected trauma surgeons. She was carrying medical identification and was dressed professionally. Officers, what exactly made you doubt her credentials? Brad was staring at the ground. Jake was staring at something in the middle distance, as if he could will himself somewhere else. The fourth complaint, Sandra continued relentlessly, came from Marcus Johnson, a city council member who was stopped while leaving a late committee meeting in the building. Officers Morrison and Collins detained him for 20 minutes, demanded multiple forms of identification, and questioned his right to be in the building. Captain Harper's jaw was working silently. Officers, Marcus Johnson has been on the city council for 6 years. His picture is posted in the lobby of this building. We don't memorize every face on every poster, Jake said weakly. But you do memorize some faces, Diane observed. Officer Morrison, how many white professionals have you stopped and searched in this area over the past 6 months? Jake's mouth opened, then closed. The math was simple and damning, according to these reports. Sandra said, consulting her tablet. Officers Morrison and Collins have detained, questioned, or searched 23 individuals in the downtown courthouse area over the past 6 months. 21 of those individuals were Black or Hispanic professionals who had legitimate reasons to be in the area. The number landed with the force of a verdict. 21 out of 23. That's not profiling, Diane said, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. That's a pattern of discrimination so clear it could be used as a textbook example. Tyrone Jackson let out a low whistle. 21 professionals, doctors, lawyers, social workers, city officials, all stopped for the crime of being Black in downtown Atlanta. Now wait, just a minute, Jake said, desperation creeping into his voice. Those statistics don't tell the whole story. Crime rates in this area, Officer Morrison, Captain Harper interrupted. What crimes did any of these 21 individuals commit? Jake's mouth worked silently. I'll answer for you, Captain Harper continued. 0. None of these individuals were arrested, cited, or charged with any crimes. They were all eventually released after being harassed for the simple act of existing while Black in a professional setting. Sandra tapped her tablet screen again. There's more. Governor Hendricks authorized a preliminary review of arrest and citation patterns for the downtown district. Officers Morrison and Collins issue citations and make arrests at rates significantly higher than their peers, but their conviction rates are significantly lower. What does that mean? Brad asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. It means, Diane explained, that you're arresting and citing people who haven't actually committed crimes. It means you're using your badges to harass citizens rather than protect them. Jerome Foster, who had been silent through most of this exchange, stepped forward. Ma'am, this level of systematic bias represents a serious civil rights violation. We're not just talking about individual misconduct anymore. You're right, Diane agreed. This is a federal issue now. The words sent a chill through the group. Federal involvement meant FBI investigation, Justice Department oversight, potential criminal charges. Federal? Jake's voice cracked. This is all being blown out of proportion. We're just doing our jobs. Officer Morrison, Diane's voice was ice cold. Your job is to serve and protect all citizens equally. Instead, you've been systematically harassing black professionals for the crime of being successful while black. That's not police work. That's state-sanctioned discrimination. She turned to Captain Harper. Captain, I want these officers' complete files by tomorrow morning. Every complaint, every incident report, every use of force documentation. And I want the files of their supervisors who failed to identify this pattern. Captain Harper nodded grimly. You'll have them. Sandra, Diane continued, I want Governor Hendricks to know that I'm recommending federal oversight of this police district pending a complete investigation of discriminatory practices. Jake Morrison's career wasn't just ending, it was becoming evidence in a federal civil rights case. Ma'am, Brad said quietly, what happens to us now? Diane looked at him for a long moment. Brad Collins had participated in the harassment, but he hadn't led it. He'd followed his partner's lead, which made him complicit but potentially redeemable. Officer Collins, that depends on your willingness to cooperate with the investigation and acknowledge the harm you've caused. She turned to Jake. Officer Morrison, you have the right to remain silent, but your silence won't protect you from the consequences of your actions. 23 incidents of harassment, a clear pattern of racial profiling, and tonight's treatment of a state official. You're not just facing termination, you're facing federal charges. The courthouse steps had become the site of a reckoning that went far beyond 2 officers and 1 incident. This was about justice, accountability, and the price of allowing bias to hide behind badges. Detective Mark Stevens arrived just as Sandra Mills was closing her tablet, having delivered the devastating statistical evidence of systematic harassment. Stevens was a 20-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, white, in his 50s, carrying himself with the careful posture of someone who had seen enough to know when a situation was spiraling beyond control. Captain Harper, he said, approaching the group, I got your call. What's the situation? Before Captain Harper could respond, Jake Morrison spoke up, his voice carrying a note of desperate hope. Detective Stevens, thank God. These people are trying to destroy our careers over a simple misunderstanding. Detective Stevens looked at the assembled group. The Attorney General, her security detail, the governor's representative, the civilian witness with his phone still ready to record, and his expression suggested he already understood this was far from simple. Officer Morrison, Stevens said carefully, why don't you walk me through what happened here? Jake launched into his version of events, painting himself and Brad as conscientious officers who had encountered a suspicious individual attempting to gain unauthorized access to a government building. He emphasized their concern for security, their attention to proper procedures, their reasonable doubts about credentials that seemed unusual. What he didn't mention was the laughter, the mocking, the assumptions about cereal box badges and con artists. When Jake finished his sanitized account, Detective Stevens turned to Diane. Ma'am, would you like to provide your perspective? Detective Stevens, Diane said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. What Officer Morrison just described bears little resemblance to what actually occurred here. But before I share my perspective, I think you should know who you're talking to. She handed him her credentials. Stevens examined them with the careful attention of an experienced officer, noting the weight, the security features, the official seals. Attorney General Washington, he said, his tone shifting immediately to one of professional respect. Ma'am, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. Detective Stevens, this wasn't an inconvenience. This was a civil rights violation carried out by officers who saw a black woman and decided she couldn't possibly be who her credentials said she was. Stevens looked from Diane to Jake to Brad, his expression growing increasingly grim as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Ma'am, can you walk me through the incident from your perspective?" Diane did, with the precise recollection of someone trained to present evidence in court. She quoted exact phrases, described specific actions, noted the timeline of events that led from her simple request for building access to officers calling her a con artist and demanding she leave the premises. When she finished, Detective Stevens was quiet for a long moment. "Detective," Tyrone Jackson said, stepping forward, "I recorded part of the incident. Would you like to see it?" Stevens nodded, and Tyrone played the video on his phone. The audio was clear. Jake Morrison's voice saying, "Real badges don't come from cereal boxes," and both officers laughing at Diane's credentials. The video ended and silence settled over the group like fog. There was no disputing what had been captured, no way to reframe laughter and mockery as legitimate security concerns. "Officer Morrison," Detective Stevens said finally, "is this your voice on the recording?" Jake's shoulders sagged. "Detective, we were just—" "Is this your voice?" "Yes. And you were mocking the Attorney General's credentials?" Jake looked around the group, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. "We didn't know she was the Attorney General." "So, you mock credentials you don't recognize instead of verifying them through proper channels?" The question hit its target. Jake had no good answer. Detective Stevens turned to Sandra Mills. "Ma'am, you mentioned additional complaints about these officers. Can you provide details?" Sandra consulted her tablet and began reading from the complaint files. Each incident followed a similar pattern. Black or Hispanic professionals approached or stopped by Officers Morrison and Collins, questioned about their presence in the area, subjected to searches or extended questioning despite having legitimate reasons to be there. Dr. Alicia Newman, emergency room physician, stopped while attending a deposition. Officers questioned her medical credentials and searched her medical bag without consent. Marcus Johnson, city council member, detained for 20 minutes while leaving a committee meeting. Officers demanded multiple forms of identification despite his ID being prominently displayed. Jerome Washington, federal prosecutor, stopped while walking from his car to the courthouse. Officers questioned his right to be in the area and demanded proof of employment. With each name, Detective Stevens' expression grew more serious. These weren't random citizens. These were respected professionals who worked in and around the courthouse regularly. "Detective," Captain Harper said, "according to preliminary statistics, Officers Morrison and Collins have detained or questioned 23 individuals in this area over 6 months. 21 were Black or Hispanic professionals." Stevens nodded slowly. "That's a pattern that would be difficult to explain as coincidental." "It's not coincidental," Diane said firmly. "It's systematic harassment of Black professionals carried out by officers who believe that professional success and Black skin are incompatible." She gestured toward the courthouse behind them. "Detective Stevens, this building represents justice and equality under law. When officers sworn to uphold that law treat citizens differently based on race, they corrupt the very foundation of what we're supposed to represent." Detective Stevens had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "Attorney General Washington, what outcome are you seeking here?" "Justice," Diane replied immediately. "Accountability for the officers involved, reform of the practices that allowed this pattern to continue, and assurance that no other professional will be harassed for the crime of succeeding while Black." Jake Morrison, who had been increasingly agitated during the recitation of complaints, finally exploded. "This is ridiculous. We're being crucified for doing our jobs. Crime rates in this area—" "Officer Morrison," Detective Stevens cut him off. "What crimes were committed by Dr. Newman, by Councilman Johnson, by Prosecutor Washington, by any of the 21 professionals you detained?" Jake's mouth opened and closed without sound. "I'll answer for you," Stevens continued. "0 crimes. You harassed 21 law-abiding citizens for the apparent crime of being successful while Black. Brad Collins, who had been increasingly distancing himself from his partner throughout the evening, finally spoke up. "Detective Stevens, I want to cooperate fully with any investigation. I realize we made serious mistakes." Jake shot him a look of betrayal. "Brad, don't..." "Don't what?" Brad snapped back. "Don't tell the truth. Don't acknowledge that we've been profiling people. Jake, I'm tired of pretending this is normal police work." He turned to face Diane directly. "Ma'am, I want to apologize not just for tonight, but for all the times we stopped people who didn't deserve it. I let myself follow Jake's lead instead of thinking for myself." "Officer Collins," Diane said, her tone softening slightly, "acknowledgement is the first step toward accountability, but apologies don't undo the harm caused to the people you harassed." "I know that," Brad replied, "but I want to make it right somehow." Keisha Davis, who had been documenting the entire conversation, looked up from her tablet. "Officer Collins, making it right would involve testifying about the pattern of harassment, cooperating with federal investigators, and participating in comprehensive bias training." Brad nodded immediately. "I'll do whatever is necessary." Jake Morrison stared at his partner like he'd never seen him before. "Brad, you're destroying both our careers." "No, Jake," Brad replied firmly. "You destroyed our careers when you decided that black professionals were automatically suspicious. I just followed you off the cliff." Detective Stevens had been watching this exchange with growing understanding. "Officer Morrison, your partner is offering to cooperate with the investigation. I strongly suggest you consider doing the same." Jake's face cycled through several emotions: anger, fear, desperation, and finally, resignation. "What kind of cooperation are we talking about?" Sandra Mills answered. "Full disclosure of all incidents involving racial profiling, testimony before a federal grand jury if charges are filed, and participation in a consent decree process that will reform policing practices in this district. And if we don't cooperate? Then you face federal civil rights charges without the benefit of cooperation agreements," Diane replied. "Officer Morrison, you systematically violated the constitutional rights of 23 citizens. The evidence is overwhelming. Your choice now is whether to be part of the solution or face the consequences alone." The courthouse steps had become an impromptu tribunal with evidence mounting and options narrowing. What had begun as two officers harassing a woman they didn't recognize had evolved into a federal case about systematic discrimination in law enforcement. Detective Stevens closed his notebook. "Attorney General Washington, I'll need to interview all the complainants mentioned in these reports. This is going to be a comprehensive investigation." "Detective," Diane said, "I want this investigation to be a model for how police departments should handle allegations of racial profiling. Thorough, transparent, and focused on preventing future incidents rather than just punishing past ones." She looked around the group one final time. "Tonight exposed a pattern of behavior that has been harming citizens and corrupting justice. We're going to fix it, starting right here, right now." The humid Atlanta evening had become the backdrop for a reckoning that would reshape how law enforcement interacted with communities of color throughout the city and beyond. As Detective Stevens concluded his initial interviews, a small crowd had begun to gather on the courthouse steps. Word of the incident had spread through the network of professionals who worked downtown, and several familiar faces had appeared to offer support or simply to witness accountability in action. The first to approach was Alicia Freeman, the social worker whose complaint Sandra Mills had mentioned earlier. She was a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed despite the late hour, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate systems that weren't always designed with her in mind. "Attorney General Washington," Alicia said, extending her hand. "I heard about what happened tonight. I wanted to thank you." "Ms. Freeman, you don't need to thank me. I'm sorry you experienced harassment from these officers." Alicia glanced at Jake and Brad, her expression mixing recognition with distaste. "Ma'am, what happened to you tonight has been happening to people like us for months. The difference is that you had the credentials and the security detail to make them listen." She turned to address the assembled group, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. 3 months ago, I was leaving a late hearing on a child custody case, emergency custody, family in crisis, the kind of case that can't wait for regular business hours. I've been handling cases like this for 15 years, working out of this courthouse longer than either of these officers has been wearing a badge. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. Officer Morrison and Officer Collins stopped me as I was walking to my car. They demanded to know what I was doing in the area, why I was there so late, where I was going. When I explained that I was a social worker leaving a hearing, they demanded proof. Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. Detective Stevens was taking notes. I showed them my state licensing, my court ID, my employee badge. Officer Morrison looked at them and said, "These could be fake. Anyone can print official-looking documents these days." The parallel to the evening's events was unmistakable. Jake's face had gone pale. They searched my purse, went through my case files, confidential client information protected by law. They questioned me for 15 minutes about cases I couldn't discuss, demanding details about families in crisis. When I explained attorney-client privilege, Officer Collins said I was being uncooperative. Alicia's voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what it's like to have your professional credentials questioned, your integrity doubted, your right to do your job challenged by people who are supposed to protect you? To be treated like a criminal for helping families in crisis?" Detective Stevens looked up from his notes. "Ms. Freeman, did you file a formal complaint about this incident?" "I tried to. I went to the police station the next day, spoke with the desk sergeant. He told me that the officers were just being thorough, that false identification was a real problem, and that I should appreciate their diligence." "Did anyone investigate your complaint?" Alicia laughed bitterly. "Detective, the desk sergeant didn't even write it down. He told me that if I didn't like police attention, I should consider why I was in areas that attracted it." Captain Harper's jaw was working silently. This wasn't just about 2 officers. It was about a system that had failed to hear complaints and failed to address patterns of abuse. Another voice joined the conversation. "She's not the only one." Everyone turned to see Dr. Alicia Newman approaching from the parking area. She was a black woman in her 50s, carrying herself with the confidence that came from saving lives in emergency rooms and commanding respect in medical settings. "Dr. Newman," Diane said, recognizing her from news reports about the hospital's trauma center. "I understand you've had experience with these officers as well." 2 months ago, Dr. Newman said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "I was here for a late-night deposition in a malpractice case. Emergency medicine keeps strange hours, and legal proceedings follow their own schedule." She looked directly at Jake and Brad. "These officers stopped me as I was leaving the building, questioned my presence here, demanded to see identification. When I showed them my medical license and hospital ID, Officer Morrison said, 'Doctors don't usually dress so casually for depositions.'" Jake's face flushed. He'd apparently made that judgment call based on Dr. Newman's choice to wear scrubs rather than a business suit, as if emergency room physicians should change clothes before attending legal proceedings. "They searched my medical bag," Dr. Newman continued, "going through prescription medications, medical instruments, confidential patient files. They questioned me about drug protocols, demanded explanations for medications that any medical professional would recognize as standard emergency supplies." Detective Stevens was writing rapidly. "Doctor, did they have probable cause for this search?" "Detective, the only cause they had was their assumption that a black woman carrying medical supplies at night must be involved in something illegal. They treated me like a drug dealer rather than a physician." Her voice hardened. "I've spent 25 years in emergency medicine. I've saved the lives of police officers, treated their families, worked closely with law enforcement on countless cases. But when these 2 officers looked at me, they didn't see Dr. Newman. They saw a black woman who didn't belong where they found her." A third person approached the group. Jerome Washington, the federal prosecutor Sandra Mills had mentioned earlier. He was a tall black man in his 40s, wearing a suit that suggested someone comfortable in courtrooms and congressional hearings. "Attorney General Washington," he said, and Diane noticed the coincidence in surnames. "I represent the U.S. Attorney's Office in cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations." He gestured toward Jake and Brad. "I've had personal experience with these officers' approach to law enforcement." "Mr. Washington, please tell us about that experience." 6 weeks ago, I was walking from my car to the courthouse for an early morning hearing in a federal case. I was carrying a briefcase, wearing a business suit, and had my federal prosecutor credentials clearly visible on my jacket. Jerome's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who spent his professional life seeking justice and had been denied it personally. Officer Morrison and Officer Collins approached me, demanded identification, questioned my right to be in the area. When I showed them my federal credentials, Officer Morrison said, "Federal prosecutors don't usually arrive this early for hearings." Jake Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the concrete. "They detained me for 10 minutes, questioned me about the case I was prosecuting, information I couldn't share due to federal restrictions. When I explained grand jury secrecy rules, Officer Collins said I was being evasive." Detective Stevens looked up from his notes. "Mr. Washington, as a federal prosecutor, you're familiar with civil rights law. In your professional opinion, do these incidents constitute a pattern of discrimination?" Jerome's smile was grim. "Detective, if I were presenting this case to a grand jury, I would argue that 23 incidents of harassment targeting Black and Hispanic professionals constitutes clear evidence of systematic civil rights violations under federal law." He turned to address the group directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here isn't just individual misconduct. This is a conspiracy to deny civil rights under color of authority, a federal felony carrying significant prison time." The word prison hit Jake Morrison like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly and he had to catch himself against the courthouse railing. "Federal charges?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "Officer Morrison," Jerome Washington replied, his prosecutorial training evident in his measured tone, "systematic violation of civil rights under color of authority carries a maximum sentence of 10 years per incident. With 23 documented cases, you're looking at potential decades in federal prison." The mathematics of justice were stark and unavoidable. Jake's face had gone ashen. Detective Stevens looked around the assembled group. 3 highly credentialed professionals who had been harassed by the same 2 officers, each incident following an identical pattern of assumption, harassment, and abuse of authority. "Attorney General Washington," he said, "I think we need to expand this investigation beyond just tonight's incident. This appears to be a systematic civil rights conspiracy." Before Diane could respond, another figure approached from the street. This was Marcus Johnson, the city council member whose detention Sandra Mills had mentioned earlier. He was a black man in his early 50s, carrying himself with the confident bearing of an elected official accustomed to public attention. "Attorney General Washington," Marcus said, extending his hand. "I heard about tonight's incident through the Downtown Professional Network. I felt I needed to be here." "Councilman Johnson, thank you for coming. I understand you've had your own encounter with these officers." Marcus nodded grimly. 2 months ago, I was leaving a late committee meeting on urban development policy. The meeting had run past 9 p.m. because we were discussing budget allocations for downtown infrastructure improvements. He gestured toward the courthouse building behind them. "I've been attending meetings in this building for 6 years as a city council member. My photograph is posted in the lobby. My name is on committee rosters. I'm not exactly an unknown figure in downtown government circles." Detective Stevens was already taking notes. "Councilman, what happened when you encountered Officers Morrison and Collins?" "They stopped me as I was walking to the parking garage, demanded identification, questioned my right to be in the building after hours. When I showed them my city council credentials, Officer Morrison said, 'These look suspicious. City council members don't usually work this late.'" Jake Morrison's face had progressed from pale to green. Each testimony was adding another nail to the coffin of his career and his freedom. Jake Morrison, who had been growing increasingly desperate as each witness testified, finally spoke up with the tone of a drowning man grasping for driftwood. "This is insane. You're all acting like we're the KKK or something. We're just cops doing our jobs." The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Even Brad Collins stared at his partner in disbelief. "Officer Morrison," Dr. Newman said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who had spent years dealing with life-and-death situations. "The KKK wore hoods to hide their identities while they terrorized black communities. You wore police badges while you did the same thing." "That's completely different." "Is it?" Jerome Washington interrupted, his prosecutorial training evident in the way he constructed his argument. "Officer Morrison, the KKK used intimidation, illegal detention, and harassment to prevent black citizens from exercising their rights. You used police powers to detain, search, and harass black professionals for exercising their right to work, to participate in government, to exist in professional settings." He stepped closer to Jake, his voice growing harder. "The only difference is that you had legal authority to carry weapons and make arrests. That makes what you did worse, not better." Captain Harper had been on her phone during this exchange, and her expression when she rejoined the conversation suggested someone who had just received very bad news. "Detective Stevens," she said, "I've just spoken with Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office. They're both launching immediate investigations. The DA is also referring this matter to federal authorities." She turned to Jake and Brad. "Officers Morrison and Collins, you're both terminated effective immediately. You'll surrender your badges, weapons, and all department equipment." "Terminated?" Jake's voice cracked. "Captain, you can't—" "Officer Morrison, you systematically violated the civil rights of 23 citizens while representing this department. You brought shame on every honest officer who wears this badge. Termination is the least of your problems." Brad Collins stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "Captain Harper, I want to cooperate fully with all investigations. I realize I participated in serious misconduct, and I want to make whatever amends are possible." Jake stared at his former partner like he'd never seen him before. "Brad, what are you doing?" "I'm accepting responsibility for my actions," Brad replied. "Jake, we systematically harassed innocent people based on their race. That's not police work. That's racism with badges." He turned to address the group of witnesses. "Ms. Freeman, Dr. Newman, Prosecutor Washington, Councilman Johnson, I participated in violating your rights, and I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but it's where I have to start." Alicia Freeman studied Brad for a long moment. "Officer Collins, apologies are meaningful only when they're followed by changed behavior and accountability. Are you prepared for both?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll testify about everything we did, cooperate with federal investigators, and participate in whatever training or reform process is necessary." Detective Stevens nodded approvingly. "Officer Collins, cooperation will be noted in your file, but it doesn't eliminate criminal liability. You still face federal charges." "I understand," Brad replied, "but I'd rather face those charges honestly than spend the rest of my life knowing I stayed silent while injustice continued." Jake Morrison looked around the group like a man suddenly realizing he was alone. His partner had abandoned him, his captain had terminated him, federal investigators were coming, and witnesses were prepared to testify against him. "This is all blown out of proportion," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We made some judgment calls that maybe weren't perfect, but we're not criminals." "Officer Morrison," Diane said, her voice carrying the full weight of legal authority, "you systematically violated the constitutional rights of 23 citizens based solely on their race. In what universe is that not criminal behavior?" Sandra Mills looked up from her tablet. "Attorney General, I've just received authorization from Governor Hendricks to announce the Georgia Police Accountability Reform Act. It mandates bias training, civilian oversight, and federal monitoring of departments with patterns of discrimination." "The Reform Act is a good start," Diane replied, But reform without accountability is meaningless. These officers need to face the full consequences of their actions. Tyrone Jackson, who had been documenting the conversation, raised his phone. Attorney General Washington, do you have a statement for the community about tonight's events? Diane looked directly into the camera, her voice carrying the authority of her office and the moral certainty of someone who had stood firm in the face of discrimination. Tonight exposed a systematic pattern of racial profiling and harassment that has been operating in our law enforcement for too long. But tonight also proved that justice is possible when citizens stand up, when witnesses speak out, and when institutions are held accountable. She gestured toward the witnesses who had testified. These professionals, a social worker, a physician, a prosecutor, a council member, they didn't just experience discrimination. They chose to speak about it, to demand accountability, to insist that the system work as promised. Her voice grew stronger. To every citizen who has been harassed, profiled, or discriminated against by people in positions of authority, your experiences matter, your voices have power, and justice is possible when we stand together. She looked directly into the camera. And to every law enforcement officer who believes that badges give them the right to treat citizens differently based on race, tonight proves that no one is above accountability, no uniform protects discrimination, and no institution will shield injustice. The recording ended, and Tyrone lowered his phone. "Ma'am, this is going to be seen by millions of people." "Good," Diane replied. "Accountability works best in the light." Detective Stevens was back on his phone, coordinating with federal authorities. When he finished the call, he addressed the group. FBI investigators will arrive tomorrow morning to begin collecting evidence for federal charges. They'll need statements from all witnesses and complete files on both officers. Captain Harper nodded grimly. "Detective, they'll have full cooperation from our department. We want this investigated thoroughly." Jerome Washington stepped forward. "Detective Stevens, as a federal prosecutor, I can tell you that this case will be a priority for the Justice Department. Systematic civil rights violations by law enforcement officers represent exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that federal civil rights laws were designed to address." Jake Morrison had been increasingly agitated during this exchange. "Federal prosecutors? FBI investigators? This is insane. We're talking about routine police work." "Routine?" Marcus Johnson's voice carried the controlled anger of an elected official who had been personally violated by the system he helped oversee. "Officer Morrison, routine police work doesn't involve detaining city council members for attending public meetings. Routine police work doesn't involve searching federal prosecutors for carrying briefcases to court." His voice grew harder. "What you call routine, the rest of us call systematic harassment based on racial discrimination. The fact that you still can't see the difference is exactly why federal oversight is necessary." Dr. Newman stepped forward. "Officer Morrison, I've worked with police officers throughout my career in emergency medicine. I've treated officers who were injured in the line of duty, worked with them on domestic violence cases, collaborated with them on public safety initiatives." Her voice carried the weight of professional authority. "Real police officers protect and serve all citizens equally. They build trust with communities, not tear it down through harassment and discrimination. What you did wasn't police work, it was abuse of power." The courthouse steps had become the site of a comprehensive indictment of systematic discrimination delivered by the very professionals who had been targeted by it. Sandra Mills consulted her tablet one final time. "Attorney General Washington, Governor Hendricks has asked me to inform you that she's scheduling a press conference tomorrow morning to announce the police reform legislation and federal oversight agreement." "Good," Diane replied. "The public deserves to know that their government takes civil rights violations seriously and that accountability will be swift and comprehensive. She looked around the assembled group one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we've done more than expose misconduct. We've demonstrated that justice is possible when citizens refuse to accept discrimination, when institutions respond to evidence, and when accountability replaces indifference. The humid Atlanta evening had become the backdrop for a reckoning that would reshape law enforcement practices throughout the state and serve as a model for accountability nationwide. Dawn was breaking over Atlanta as the final pieces of the investigation fell into place. Detective Stevens had spent the night coordinating with federal authorities, while Captain Harper worked with Internal Affairs to review every case file involving Officers Morrison and Collins. The courthouse steps, which had been the site of confrontation and revelation just hours earlier, were now quiet in the early morning light. Inside the courthouse, Diane Washington sat in her office, reviewing the preliminary federal report that had arrived by secure email at 5:47 a.m. Jerome Foster, her security chief, and Keisha Davis, her legal counsel, flanked her as she read through findings that confirmed their worst suspicions about the scope of systematic discrimination. The FBI's preliminary review identified 47 additional incidents involving Officers Morrison and Collins over the past 18 months. Diane said, looking up from the report. All but 3 involved Black or Hispanic citizens. All but 1 resulted in detention, search, or harassment without probable cause. Keisha shook her head. 57 total incidents. That's not aberrant behavior, that's a sustained campaign of racial profiling. Jerome consulted his own notes. Ma'am, the federal investigators also found evidence of supervisory knowledge and institutional indifference. At least 3 different supervisors received complaints about these officers and failed to investigate or discipline them. Diane's phone buzzed with a call from Governor Hendricks. She answered on speaker. Diane, I've been reviewing the federal findings all night. This is worse than we initially thought. Governor, we're looking at systematic civil rights violations enabled by institutional failure. This goes beyond 2 rogue officers. That's why I'm announcing comprehensive police reform legislation this morning, and I'm requesting federal oversight of the entire Atlanta Police Department pending completion of the investigation. Diane nodded approvingly. Federal oversight is appropriate. This department has demonstrated that it cannot police itself effectively when it comes to racial discrimination. Diane, I also want you to know that Jake Morrison has been arrested on federal civil rights charges. Brad Collins is cooperating with investigators and will likely face reduced charges in exchange for his testimony. The news wasn't surprising, but it confirmed that accountability was moving from the theoretical to the practical. Across town, in a federal holding facility, Jake Morrison sat in an interview room facing FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres and Civil Rights Division Attorney David Kim. The walls were institutional beige, the fluorescent lights harsh, the atmosphere one of impending judgment. Officer Morrison, Agent Torres said, consulting a thick file. We've documented 57 incidents over 18 months where you and Officer Collins detained, searched, or harassed citizens without probable cause. 54 of those citizens were Black or Hispanic. Jake's lawyer, a public defender named Robert Hayes, leaned forward. Agent Torres, my client is prepared to discuss a plea agreement. Mr. Hayes, Attorney Kim replied. Your client systematically violated the civil rights of dozens of citizens while acting under color of authority. The evidence is overwhelming. The only question is whether Officer Morrison wants to cooperate with our investigation of supervisory complicity. Jake looked smaller than he had on the courthouse steps, diminished by the weight of federal charges and the reality of potential decades in prison. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? Hayes asked. Complete disclosure of all incidents involving racial profiling, testimony about supervisory knowledge and institutional practices that enabled discrimination, and cooperation in reforming police training and accountability measures. Jake's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. If I cooperate, what happens to me? Attorney Kim's expression was grave. Officer Morrison, you face 57 federal charges carrying potential sentences of up to 10 years each. Even with full cooperation, you're looking at significant prison time. The question is whether you want to serve 25 years or life. Justice were stark and unavoidable. Jake's choices had narrowed to variations of accountability rather than escape from it. Meanwhile, in another part of the federal building, Brad Collins sat with his own attorney, a private defender named Lisa Chen, facing the same investigative team. Officer Collins, Agent Torres said, your cooperation last night demonstrated genuine remorse and willingness to accept responsibility. That will be noted in our report to the prosecutor. Brad nodded, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Agent Torres, I want to cooperate fully. I participated in systematic discrimination, and I want to help ensure it doesn't continue. That means testifying against your former partner, against supervisors who enabled this behavior, and participating in comprehensive reform of department practices. I understand. I'll do whatever is necessary to make this right. Attorney Kim leaned forward. Officer Collins, with full cooperation, you're looking at reduced federal charges and likely state probation rather than federal prison time. But you need to understand that cooperation means complete honesty about everything you and Officer Morrison did. I understand, Brad replied. I've spent the night thinking about every incident. Every time we stopped someone without cause. Every time we let assumptions override proper procedure. Washington, FBI Special Agent Torres, and representatives from civil rights organizations throughout Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Hendricks began, last night's incident at the state courthouse exposed systematic civil rights violations that demand immediate and comprehensive response. She gestured toward Diane. Attorney General Washington's experience was not isolated. It was part of a pattern of racial profiling and harassment that affected dozens of citizens over 18 months. The assembled reporters were furiously taking notes. This wasn't just a local police scandal, it was a federal case with implications for law enforcement practices nationwide. Effective immediately, Governor Hendricks continued, I'm signing the Georgia Police Accountability Reform Act, which mandates federal oversight of departments with patterns of discrimination, acquires bias training for all officers, and establishes civilian oversight boards with real authority to investigate and discipline misconduct. Diane stepped to the podium. The Reform Act represents institutional change, but institutional change without individual accountability is meaningless. That's why I'm announcing that the state of Georgia will fully cooperate with federal prosecution of civil rights violations by law enforcement officers. She looked directly into the cameras. No badge protects discrimination. No uniform shields harassment. No institution will enable systematic violation of citizens' rights. Agent Torres provided the federal perspective. The FBI has opened a comprehensive civil rights investigation into the Atlanta Police Department. We will examine not just individual misconduct, but the institutional practices that enabled and protected it. The questions from reporters were sharp and focused. Attorney General Washington, how many officers are involved in this investigation? The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary findings suggest institutional problems that go beyond individual officers to supervisory failure and systemic indifference to discrimination. Governor Hendricks, what assurances can you give that this won't happen again? Federal oversight, civilian review, mandatory training, and swift prosecution of violations. We're not just addressing symptoms, we're reforming the system that created them. Agent Torres, what charges are the officers facing? Federal civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242. These charges carry potential sentences of up to 10 years per incident, and we've documented 57 incidents. The press conference continued for 30 minutes, but the message was clear. Accountability was comprehensive, reform was mandatory, and the old system of protecting discrimination behind badges was ending. Later that afternoon, in her office, Diane received calls from civil rights organizations, law enforcement reform groups, and officials from other states interested in implementing similar accountability measures. "Ma'am," Keisha said, reviewing the call log, "you've received requests for interviews from 63 media outlets, invitations to speak at 42 conferences, and consultation requests from 17 state attorneys general." Diane looked out her window at the courthouse steps, where everything had begun just 18 hours earlier. "Keisha, one incident became a federal case because citizens were willing to speak, witnesses were willing to testify, and institutions were willing to act. That's how systemic change happens, one moment of accountability at a time." She turned back to her desk, where files of police reform legislation waited for review. But the real test isn't whether we can respond to crisis. It's whether we can prevent the next one. The sun was setting over Atlanta, ending a day that had begun with confrontation and was concluding with comprehensive reform. On courthouse steps, where laughter had once greeted an attorney general's badge, federal investigators were now ensuring that such mockery would never again hide behind the shield of institutional indifference. 6 months after that humid Tuesday evening on the courthouse steps, the transformation of Atlanta's law enforcement was complete. The federal consent decree had been signed, comprehensive reforms were in place, and the trials of officers Morrison and Collins had concluded with verdicts that sent shockwaves through police departments nationwide. Diane, Washington, stood once again on the courthouse steps, but this time she was flanked by the citizens whose courage had made accountability possible. Alicia Freeman, Dr. Newman, Jerome Washington, Marcus Johnson, and Tyrone Jackson had all become symbols of civic engagement and the power of testimony in the face of institutional discrimination. 6 months ago, Diane addressed the assembled crowd of reporters, community leaders, and law enforcement officials. These steps witnessed systematic discrimination hiding behind badges. Today, they represent the promise of equal justice under law. The statistics told the story of transformation. Under federal oversight, complaints against Atlanta police had dropped by 73%. Use of force incidents involving minorities had decreased by 68%. Community trust in law enforcement, measured by independent polling, had increased by 45%. But numbers only tell part of the story, Diane continued. The real story is told by citizens who no longer fear harassment for the crime of professional success while black, by families who trust that their sons and daughters will be treated fairly by police, by communities that see law enforcement as protectors rather than predators. Jake Morrison had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to 47 counts of civil rights violations. His cooperation in exposing supervisory complicity had earned him a reduced sentence, but his career in law enforcement was over forever. Brad Collins had received probation and community service after his extensive cooperation with federal investigators. He was currently working as a security guard while pursuing a degree in social work, his testimony having helped convict 3 supervisors who had ignored patterns of discrimination. Officer Collins's transformation demonstrates that accountability and redemption are not mutually exclusive. Diane said, "When someone acknowledges its wrongdoing, accepts responsibility, and commits to making amends, our justice system should provide paths to redemption that serve the community." The reforms implemented under federal oversight had become a model for police departments nationwide. Mandatory bias training, civilian oversight boards with investigative authority, early warning systems to identify problematic officers, and swift disciplinary procedures for discrimination complaints. But the most important reform, Diane said, is cultural. We've changed the expectation from protecting bad officers to supporting good ones, from tolerating discrimination to actively preventing it, from reactive discipline to proactive accountability. Alicia Freeman stepped to the podium. Attorney General Washington's courage in standing firm that night gave voice to all of us who had been silenced by a system that didn't want to hear our complaints. Her voice carried the strength of someone who had found justice after experiencing its denial. But courage isn't just about one moment of confrontation. It's about the sustained commitment to ensure that our victory becomes a foundation for lasting change. Dr. Newman followed her. "As a physician, I've learned that treating symptoms without addressing underlying causes only provides temporary relief. What we accomplished here was surgery on a diseased system, removing the cancer of discrimination and rebuilding healthy tissue of accountability." Jerome Washington, the federal prosecutor, provided the legal perspective. "This case has become precedent for civil rights enforcement nationwide. 43 states have implemented similar oversight measures, and federal prosecution of police civil rights violations has increased by 200%. Marcus Johnson, the city council member, addressed the political dimensions. "Local government has a responsibility to ensure that the officers we fund, the departments we oversee, and the policies we implement serve all citizens equally." This case reminded us that political leadership means more than managing budgets. It means protecting civil rights. Tyrone Jackson, the young man whose phone recording had captured crucial evidence, spoke last among the witnesses. "I recorded that night because I'd seen too many incidents where there was no evidence, no accountability, no consequences. Technology gave us proof, but courage gave us justice." The press conference concluded with questions that demonstrated how far the conversation had progressed from individual misconduct to systematic reform. Attorney General Washington, how do you measure the success of these reforms? Success is measured not just by complaint statistics or use of force data, but by whether citizens feel safe in their interactions with law enforcement, whether parents can tell their children that police are there to help them, not harass them. Dr. Newman, what advice do you have for other communities facing similar problems? Document everything. Speak out consistently. Demand accountability persistently. Change happens when silence is replaced by testimony, when isolation is replaced by solidarity, when indifference is replaced by engagement. Mr. Jackson, what role does technology play in police accountability? Recording incidents is important. The real power is in using technology to organize communities, share information, and coordinate responses to discrimination. Justice requires both evidence and engagement. As the press conference ended and the crowd dispersed, Diane remained on the courthouse steps with her original security team. Jerome Foster, who had coordinated the response that first night, and Keisha Davis, whose legal expertise had shaped the federal case. "Ma'am," Jerome said, "you could have handled that night quietly, internally, without the public confrontation. Why did you choose transparency?" Diane considered the question. looking up at the building where her name was still engraved on the door, where her office overlooked the steps where everything had changed. Jerome, civil rights violations thrive in darkness, behind closed doors, in quiet conversations where accountability is negotiated rather than demanded. That night, I chose light over darkness, public accountability over private resolution. She gestured toward the street where citizens were returning to their daily lives, no longer burdened by the fear of harassment that had shadowed their professional success. The choice wasn't whether to confront discrimination. Discrimination had already confronted me. The choice was whether to let it continue in silence or expose it to the consequences it deserved. Keisha nodded. "Ma'am, this case changed how civil rights law is enforced nationwide. Federal prosecutors are now treating systematic police discrimination as organized crime, using RICO statutes and conspiracy charges that carry serious prison time." Diane replied, "When law enforcement officers systematically violate the rights they're sworn to protect, they should face the same serious consequences as any other organized criminal enterprise." As the sun set over Atlanta, painting the courthouse steps in golden light, Diane Washington reflected on a simple truth: justice delayed might be justice denied, but justice documented, demanded, and delivered becomes justice sustained. The badge that had been mocked by officers who couldn't see past the color of her skin was now a symbol of accountability achieved and reform accomplished. The steps where laughter had greeted her credentials were now a testament to the power of standing firm when standing alone. 6 months earlier, 2 officers had made assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence, bias rather than procedure, stereotype rather than reality. Their laughter had echoed off courthouse walls, confident that their badges protected their discrimination. But badges don't protect discrimination when citizens stand up, when witnesses speak out, when institutions choose accountability over indifference. Justice prevails not when it's easy or convenient, but when it's necessary and demanded. On courthouse steps where mockery had once reigned, the rule of law now stood supreme, protecting all citizens equally under its impartial gaze. The Attorney General's badge had been vindicated not through anger or retaliation, but through the simple, powerful act of insisting that justice apply to everyone, especially those sworn to uphold it. And in Atlanta, on courthouse steps, where everything had changed in one humid evening, the promise of equal protection under law was finally being kept.